Welcome to Speak Arizona, the ultimate podcast for professionals looking to elevate their speaking skills in the workplace, meetings, and beyond. Whether you're aiming to captivate an audience, lead a successful meeting, or enhance your professional presence, this podcast is your go-to resource for actionable tips, expert insights, and inspiring stories. Join us as we delve into the art of effective communication. Speak Arizona is powered by District 3 Toastmasters. Subscribe now and take the first step towards becoming the speaker you've always wanted to be.
Welcome to Speak Arizona, a podcast dedicated to empowering you to find your voice. Hi, I'm your host, Rupesh. I help technical experts upgrade from being the smartest person in the room to being the most influential, one conversation at a time. With me today is Tatum O Kennedy. Tatum, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Tatum O Kennedy, and I solve problems for a living, whether it's working with complex pharmaceutical data as a senior analytics engineer at Seek, or building stronger, more inclusive teams as the chair of the Women of Seek. I have 6 years of leading women's ERGs that has taught me that great team building isn't about trust falls or icebreakers. It's about creating environments where people feel seen, heard, and empowered to do their best work.
Tatum and I actually worked together for 3 years at Seek, and she really helped me develop all and many of the team buildings that we did. We had lots of fun. We had a great time, which is why I thought of Tatum when I wanted to talk about this topic. So, Tatum, let's get into it. You mentioned that team building is more than just trust falls and escape room activities, which I love. What does what does the role of team building play in effective leadership in your experience?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think to me, the key piece that I like to remember here is that team building is really just proactive leadership in a different form. To me, it's a lot about making the foundation that you need your team to have in terms of resilience before you actually need it. So, for example, Rupesh, you and I wrote an article that you posted on LinkedIn about this very topic, and you mentioned an earthquake example where oftentimes teams find themselves waiting for those fire alarm moments where they really need their team to work as a team to actually bring their teams together. But I find that most effective leadership is really demonstrated when you're anticipating those events beforehand and building your team connections beforehand. You're not waiting for the fire to happen or the earthquake to happen to actually make your team feel like a team. I think when you are investing in team building consistently, it's not just about organizing activities, which might be what a lot of people think of when they hear team building. It's about creating psychological safety. It's about creating trust. It's about creating communication pathways for your team. And this all is really crucial during those high pressure earthquake type moments. I think in the end, it's the difference between scrambling to build your team during a crisis versus having that cohesive unit ready to actually tackle the challenges together.
I really like what you said about proactive leadership. Did I come up with that, or is that yours?
And I don't know. At this point, our ideas jumble a lot together.
I like it. And the other thing you mentioned that I want to dig into, this is a podcast about improving your communication styles. And my angle of this is improving your communication styles to help you become a better and more influential leader. And you mentioned something that I really like. I've heard this before, psychological safety, building resilience, but the thing that I want to just dive into a little bit more is what you said about communication pathways. Tell me more about that? Have you seen where you've done team buildings and those communication pathways are there and you've had a great team, or where they haven't? Like, I love that terminology because that's what I was thinking about, but I didn't put it to words when I initially wanted to bring this topic to the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll talk about this probably a little more later too, but to me, it's just building a space where different communication styles have channels and outlets to go. And so you probably know from your work with Toastmasters and from your work as leaders at various organizations that different people communicate in different ways. So team building is never a one size fits all type of activity. You really have to keep in mind the different communication styles within your team or across teams, depending on what you're doing when you're building those type of events.
Okay. And I'm actually going to jump right to that question because I was reading, because Tatum inspired me to, as her Women of CERG employee research group, How Women Rise by Sally Helgeson and Marshall Goldsmith. And I want to read a passage. And you mentioned people build communication pathways or have different styles. I want to read this and just get into a little bit of gender dynamics when it comes to team building. So I'm quoting, this is chapter 14 or habit 10 too much from How Women Rise. Researchers like Deborah Tannen, who study women's communication styles, note that women deploy personal information as the primary means of bonding with one another. They share private hopes and dreams, but also dissect their beliefs, their faults and problems, detail doubts about themselves, and reveal the messy details of troubled relationships. This frank exchange of shared vulnerabilities creates a feeling of intimacy and regarded as a sign of trust. By contrast, men rarely build relationships by exchanging intimacies or dissecting problems. Men are, in fact, more likely to bond with one another by doing things together, often in highly competitive situations. So a subtle or not so subtle one-upmanship often characterizes male bonding. This dynamic leaves no place for sharing of vulnerabilities. The difference in male and female bonding styles generally serves women well, making them more likely than men to form close and long-lasting friendships. And it goes on to talk about the impacts of that. But can you talk a little bit about, as you have done various team building activities, any gender dynamics that you have noticed?
Yeah, I think this is a really fascinating topic and could probably be its own podcast series in itself. But this dynamic that you described from the book is exactly something I've observed over, as I mentioned, 6 years of leading women's employee resource groups, excuse me, or ERGs. I think, like you said, I've noticed that women really approach team building being focused on relationship building, on that kind of sub aspect of it, and creating those safe spaces where they can be vulnerable. I think overall we do tend to share more personal context and focus a little bit more on emotional connection because for us that equates to psychological safety oftentimes. In contrast, I've noticed in mixed gender settings that women might initially hold back a little bit more, especially when it's focused in a male-dominated industry like tech or pharma, for example, where my area of focus is. And so when I'm working on team building, I try to design activities with multiple engagement styles. I think having kind of a contrast where some are allowing for a little bit deeper sharing, others might be a little bit more task focused. So you can imagine a typical layout for our virtual meetings at Seek, since we are a fully remote company, where we have some full group sharing. So you'll have a group of 20 to 40, just depending, all in one forum. We might have a mixture with some breakout sessions that have more targeted discussion questions, that kind of mixture of pieces. And I think the key here for me is recognizing, again, going back to what we said before, that effective teams need that collaborative relationship building kind of style that you might traditionally see more women often bring, along with the direct, more results oriented approaches that might be more typically encouraged in men. And I think I just want to caveat, it's not to say that men can't be collaborative, they can't build relationships, and women can't be results oriented, but I think that there is certainly centuries of relationship dynamics at play, as they discuss in that book, about how we approach our professional lives differently as men and women. And so sorry, a long tangent here, but the key that I want to say is just, if you're blending these styles very intentionally and accommodating the maybe more stereotypical strengths between women and men and accounting for the differences there, you're going to get your stronger, more resilient teams.
I want to share a story about when I first started working at Seek, and actually this was also what I used to do prior to ExxonMobil. So in 2020, I, like many with the pandemic, went down a Brene Brown fanatic. And one of the things she suggested was at the start of every meeting to start it with a 2-word check-in. And it shared 2 words about what you're feeling or what you're doing. And it was interesting because my team at Seek was predominantly male. And while I think the team usually humored me and we as a team got a lot out of it, it always felt like something was missing. And so I would do that every week. And then of course during every quarter or whatever, when we did team building activities, we would do more competitive things, and you would see different folks, and you'd see different folks, different gender dynamics, whatever, reacting to those differently. And sometimes, even like you said, sometimes women love the competitive stuff too. So it's not really about the gender, but it's just about being aware of those individuals and those differences. And when I read that chapter, I had so many aha moments on how I was leading, because Brene Brown's ideas and the way she was approaching at least that specific thing on team building to me was all about vulnerabilities. And it was so fresh because we hadn't done that in the tech or oil and gas world. I really leaned into it, not realizing until I read that chapter, whoa, other people, not all the people on the team will connect in that way. And whether they're male or female, whatever. And going forward, I really want to intentionally think about, okay, sure, we can do the 2-word check-in and really focus in on vulnerabilities to build team, but I also should mix that in with more competitive or one-up man quote unquote tile activity. So to me, that was just such an interesting thing about not just team building, but communication in general, building those communication pathways. Sometimes you really need to get into vulnerabilities. Sometimes you just need to have a competition to see who's the fastest at doing something silly. And you need to have both.
Yeah. And I think to add there, as a former member of that team, I think at the beginning it did often feel like pulling teeth, waiting for some of those folks to give their 2-word check-ins. But I think it was also a testament of how much people can grow and develop, because I think by the end of your tenure as manager of that group, people were a lot more comfortable sharing. And in contrast, I'm not a very competitive person, but I really began to enjoy those more competitive team building game style events as well. And so I think, to me, it's not try it once and it doesn't work, let's move on. I think there is an element of let's keep making this a muscle memory for people and more comfortable to build that vulnerability in different ways as well.
And in the book, they say that because generally women build relationships through sharing vulnerabilities, they have stronger relationships. So to your point, I think we need to not give up if something doesn't work right away, which I like. We've been talking a lot about some gender dynamics, but I want to take a step back and talk about how you design team building activities. So we talked about one aspect of competitive versus sharing vulnerabilities to build those communication pathways. What are some of the other things that you think about when you are building team building activities?
Yeah, this is a great question. I would say I think the most important thing and what it really all boils down to is that communication pathways piece of it. Stepping back, I think that's always behind the scenes for me, but I always start at first with understanding my audience and being really crystal clear, both with myself and with participants, about what the goal is of the event. For example, if this is about a new team getting to know each other, that's going to look like a very different activity than an established group that needs to work on their collaboration. From there, that's where I pivot to focusing on that inclusive engagement, tying back to those communication pathways, making activities that work both for introverts and extroverts, for people's different communication styles, for people's various comfort levels, things like that. And I've learned that certainly the best team building is never a one size fits all. You're not going to make a single activity within an event that everyone loves. It's never going to happen. So if it's trivia night or you're having a guest speaker on intersectionality or professional development discussions, I just try to fit in variety so that everyone can really engage authentically. And for example, in the Women of Seek, I always try to have some sort of regular rotation between social events where we can unwind and meet that psychological safety need that most of the women really crave. Some rotation with developmental events like how you can build your perfect elevator pitch, or professional events like networking or mentoring. I think the key is just making sure that people are feeling heard, valued, and connected across that different variety of events or activities within an event, not just entertained.
I think being intentional, as you said, which is not something I've done in the past when I think of team building events. I've gone into it just thinking about having fun or what people aren't going to cringe and do. And you have taught me to think more intentionally about all these different things, and this exposure to at least this aspect of the gender dynamics continues my thinking on how to create those successful team building activities. And I just want to plug that you've sparked my interest in having more conversation about setting up a elevator pitch discussion. So we'll save that for a future podcast, Tatum.
Perfect.
Okay. Can you tell me a moment where you, or a time when you successfully, this sounds like a job interview. Tell me about a time you successfully built a sense of community with a team.
Yeah, I think I've had the opportunity over the time leading the Women of Seek the past couple of years to actually do this a lot more often than I would have expected when I first stepped into the role. I think one of my proudest moments was definitely transforming that Women of Seek group into what's now considered the gold standard of ERGs at our company, which has been really fulfilling. We went from a really small, pretty disconnected group to a really thriving community by, like I mentioned before, just intentionally creating multiple touch points for engagement. And so we started offering everything from career development sessions to more casual trivia events, and going back to those communication pathways, ensuring that there's something for everybody, regardless of what stage of their career they're in, what their interests are, whether they're introverts, extroverts, considering all of that and having something to offer no matter where you are in your journey. And I think what really made the difference there was including allies and voices from across the organization. So it's never been siloed to just the women in the company, it's been open to allies as well. And so we've seen that shift from just a subgroup of the company to a place where we now have software engineers collaborating with customer success managers. We have senior leaders engaged in discussions with really early career professionals. And we have real conversations happening about the challenges that we've faced and the victories that we've won, open for everybody in the company to engage in, listen to, and learn from. And I think that we've really seen that community grow because people are able to feel genuinely supported by the women encountering similar challenges, and also seen by allies and people who maybe aren't as familiar with what we're facing.
I think I've attended many of those Women of Seek events, and sometimes it's funny to think, what does, for example, one of my most memorable ones with you was you used AI to generate like Hallmark Christmas movie themes, and people had to guess which was a real movie and which was fake. And I think everyone did horribly at that competition. But what does that have to do with building those communities? But I think it has a lot to do with it. And it's a really interesting journey that I saw as you were leading the Women of Seek go from, as you said, totally disjointed, disconnected, to having these really deep conversations where people are like, whoa, I didn't realize career development occurred this way for women, or this was a struggle for this group of people. And that's been really fun to watch. So that's one of my memorable ones. What's one of your most memorable or unexpected team building moments?
I think one of the most memorable moments, and this one was a completely positive experience, was during a company event that we had in Florida where I was tasked alongside you, Rupesh, with bringing together our engineering team and our customer success managers from that globally distributed team. So for example, you and I probably work together every single day, but there were engineers in Asia who I would rarely interface with, and we were all going to be together and have a team building activity. And as I mentioned, a lot of those people did not interact on the day to day or even at all during a month. And so I was really nervous going in because I wanted to create something that would work both for the introverts and the extroverts in our group, considering some of the cultural differences as well. All of those aspects were certainly at play here. And so I designed an event that started with drinks and dinner in a space where we had both communal areas and then also smaller tables. So accommodating those different comfort zones and the different communication pathways between the folks present, so that if you wanted to hide in a smaller table as an introvert, you're totally welcome to do that, or be the life of the party at the bar, whatever your preference is. And then from there, we transitioned to escape rooms. So I strategically prearranged some teams to mix people who wouldn't normally collaborate. And while this sounds pretty typical, like choosing an escape room for a team building event, I think there's actually a lot at play behind the scenes here, because this actually meets a lot of different needs as an activity, considering that competitive edge that a lot of men like to have when they're trying to do team building. Escape rooms certainly do that when you're working as teams, but then you also have those really small sub teams where an introvert might be a little bit more comfortable opening up and working through a challenge where they wouldn't be in a bigger group. And so there's actually a lot of dynamics at play there that made this a pretty strategic decision for us. And I think what made it really unexpectedly powerful too was seeing how quickly those barriers dissolved when people were problem solving together in a really low pressure and fun environment. And then I think you can attest to this too. We saw a lot of real magic happen afterwards. We were seeing new connections carry forward into work. People who had really not spoken very often before were more open to collaborating or sharing ideas. And then those friendships, I think, really continued beyond the office too. So for me, what this all really reinforced was that the best team building events aren't just isolated to those events. They're focused on those ripple effects that happen after and extend way beyond when the event actually ends. I think sometimes you really just need to get people out of their job, out of the usual context of what they're doing in a day, to see what's possible when they're allowed to connect as their full person instead of just their job title.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Okay, Tatum, last question before the rapid fire. And feel free to provide some feedback to me or not. So, what's one team building mistake you've observed that leadership makes, and how can they avoid it?
Yeah, this is a really great question. I think each year that I've been in industry, I've seen like a bigger and bigger push for team building. And I think this is really hand in hand with the biggest mistake that you can see leadership do, which is treating team building just like a checkbox. So you'll see a lot of organizations doing an annual retreat or an offsite, and then check, we did the team building, we paid for their flights, we're done. I think the key to team building is that it should be ongoing and it should be embedded in some way in your regular workflow. So, a leader might plan a really elaborate event, and then as soon as you're back on site or back to your day to day, you're back to that purely transactional interaction that you have in the office. I think what would be even more impactful and honestly would be better for the company financially too is just working on building those micro moments of connection into regular meetings. So, like you mentioned, doing those 2-word check-ins, something as simple as that, where you're opening that channel for communication, for psychological safety, for vulnerability, having space for people to just share their wins, or asking something as simple as, what are you drinking out of? Which is something you mentioned in our article, which is just such a silly question, but it takes you out of that transactional kind of work talk that people are used to and lets you open up a little bit more. And to go back to what I said at the very beginning too, I think team building isn't separate from leadership. It is leadership. It's about consistently having those opportunities for your team to see each other, not just as an engineer or a customer success manager or whatever it might be, but as a whole human outside of your job function.
I really liked what you said about keeping team building ongoing, whether it's a big event or doing things smaller. I remember, and I forgot to mention this earlier, one of my most memorable or unexpected team building moments was doing virtual jigsaw puzzles. It's a personal hobby of mine. I love doing jigsaw puzzles. I'm more than slightly addicted. It was really interesting, though, when we put a jigsaw puzzle virtually in front of a team to see how quickly everyone else got engaged and how there was a little competition there. And also, somehow, when our hands were busy and we weren't trying to make people share vulnerable things, they did. It was the most interesting and fun experience for me. So I started incorporating jigsaw puzzles in a way to do ongoing team building. And the topics that would come up, we'd tackle real engineering issues, personal topics, kind of anything. And it was so natural. And I think thinking back now, I have to remember there was all of little moments ahead of that we were just slowly building to that point to where we could have that psychological safety. And the other thing I wanted to share on big company events and team building is, and incorporating that, there's always those inside jokes or there's different things that happened that naturally come up in conversation or naturally occur. I remember one year I won the award for the most slacks in the company in a year. And it was really a funny one-time thing, but people brought that into other events and other get to know your colleagues and different things like that. So bringing those inside jokes up and recalling that time when everyone was together, I think is another way to incorporate that longer term team building, because it makes everyone feel like they're on the inside unless they weren't there. So
Agreed.
maybe that's another topic. Tatum, that was so great. Anything else that you want to share on team building? I feel like we covered a lot on communication, team building, relationships, all the things I love to talk about.
Yeah, I guess just closing thought. I think sometimes it can feel daunting to take on a role where you are responsible in some sense for team building. I think going back to the gender dynamic as well, it can be especially daunting for women because it feels like you might be pigeonholing yourself into an event planning sort of role, which can be challenging if you are a more technical person like myself. I've learned to not shy away from the opportunities because, as I've mentioned a few times now, I think team building is leadership. It is a way to make yourself more visible, to get to know all of the members of your team, which is invaluable, being able to understand how people work, their personalities, things like that. And I would say don't shy away from it. Challenge yourself, push yourself, make it fun, have your goal in mind, and best of luck to those taking on those challenges.
You heard it here. Team building is leadership, proactive leadership. Tatum O Kennedy. All right. I want to pivot into the rapid fire section of my podcast. And I'm trying out these questions. I'm wondering if I make these consistent or shake them up. So let me know afterwards.
How rapid fire are we talking? Do I get like one word? Can I explain myself?
Oh, you can explain yourself.
Okay.
You can explain. Let's see. Maybe it's funny just to leave it as one word. Okay, let's see how this goes.
Okay.
So what book, article, or podcast has inspired you recently? Or what are you reading right now?
Besides this podcast, obviously being my biggest inspiration, one book that I've really enjoyed recently is Piranesi by Susanna Clark. I don't want to give anything away if someone hasn't read it, but it's about somebody who's stuck in a really confusing kind of labyrinth style place, and he manages to find a lot of meaning and a sense of wonder while he's there. So I think it's unlike anything I've ever read. I would definitely recommend.
Can you spell Piranesi? I'm just kidding.
P-I-R-O. I was going to.
Is that a word or just a name?
I think it's a name, I think from Greek mythology.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. What is your biggest public speaking pet peeve, or what's one thing you wish speakers would just stop doing?
I absolutely detest when I'm at an in-person presentation and the speaker is turned around and reading their slides and pointing to their slides. It drives me absolutely insane. It feels like they're unprepared, even if they are way over prepared. It feels like they could have just sent me their PowerPoint as a email attachment and we would have gotten the same information. So if you are doing a presentation with a PowerPoint, please don't do that.
Love it. Yes, you are the presentation, not your slides. That could be an email. Ooh, that's a good transition to my next question. Quick pick. What's your go-to way to collaborate? Email, in-person, Teams, Zoom, Slack, text, calls?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am an introvert, so typically not in person for me. I'll pick two. I like Zoom if I need to see somebody's face, and then Slack for everything else.
Not as much as I Slack, but
Yeah.
maybe a close second. Okay, since we are a speaking podcast, what was your last major speaking gig?
I gave a presentation a couple weeks ago now in Dublin, Ireland for a SEEK conference about leveraging AI in the pharmaceutical industry.
Ooh, nice. Okay, since I know a little bit about this talk, can you talk a little bit more about that? Sounds really technical and has the potential to be very generic and boring. What
Mhm.
did you do to keep people interested in AI and all this stuff? Because it's such a noisy space these days.
Yeah. One thing that I did was I tried to make it into a story more than anything else. So I didn't want to just talk about here's how you could use AI in R&D and here's how you can use it in commercial manufacturing. I made it into a story of say you're at this pharmaceutical plant and you have these four personas who are working on a batch throughout the day. Here are the challenges each of them are facing. How can AI help them? And so it made it more relatable and easier to follow than just bullet of what we can do with AI.
Nice. Tell a story. I agree. Okay. What's one piece of advice you'd give to a new public speaker?
Honestly, I think a little cliche, but I think challenge yourself and step outside of your comfort zone. I think it's really easy, like we've mentioned, to just have that PowerPoint, give the presentation, state the facts. But I think the more that you're pushing yourself to be different and to have fun with it, then the easier that it will get, the better a speaker that you'll be, and then the more likely people will remember what you have to say. One other thing I'll add about an example here in relation to the Dublin presentation that I gave. I had a lot of fun with it and really tried to personalize my content and take a risk with it. The week before the presentation, I actually was traveling all around Dublin meeting with some of our customers at Seek. And so I used a lot of the discussions that I had there in my talk. And I actually made a joke about sheep farming to start us out. I was a little bit worried that it wouldn't land or that it might offend some Irish people who maybe have sheep farmers in their family, but it totally did land. And I think it made my talk really memorable. So have fun, push yourself, and make it fun for everyone else.
Take risks. I love it. Tatum, anything else before we close out the podcast today?
No, I just really appreciate you having me on and am looking forward to our next team building events with Women of Seek as well. Appreciate you having me.
Thanks. And I am going to reach out again. We're going to have that elevator pitch discussion because that is so aligned with what we talk about here. All right. Thanks for tuning in. If you want to hear more, hit that subscribe button. But until next time, we encourage you to speak Arizona.